I remember the smell, first gunpowder thick in the air, sweat turning to dust on our skin, and the acrid bite of fear in every breath. My name is Charles Windolph, and on that day, I was just another private in the 7th Cavalry, praying the ground wouldn't open and swallow me whole. The Sioux and Cheyenne came at us like a storm. Their cries rose high and sharp, rattling the bones in my chest. I saw them sweeping in from every side, riding hard, faces painted, eyes fixed like arrows aimed straight at our souls. Lieutenant Colonel Custer stood tall on the ridge, waving his hat like a man who believed the world still belonged to him. "Hold your ground!" he shouted. His voice cut through the chaos for one brief moment before everything shattered. Bullets hissed, horses screamed, men dropped all around me, some clutching wounds they'd never walk away from. A hot sting tore into my arm, but I didn't stop. I crawled through the dirt, hands trembling, shoving cartridges toward my brothers who still had the strength to shoot. I yelled for them to keep firing, though part of me knew it wouldn't change the ending. I had no time to be brave. I had time only to survive keeping low, staying quiet when the firing lulled, and praying each breath wouldn't be my last. Many never saw another sunrise. I did. And for years afterward, people wanted me to tell them about that glorious last stand. But what I remember isn't glory, it's the smoke, the terror, and the look in every man's eyes when he realized this was the end. Before the blood soaked the earth at Little Bighorn, the fire had been smoldering for years. And I, Private Charles Windolph, was tossed right into the middle of it, barely understanding how deep the storm ran. You see, this wasn't just a battle between soldiers and warriors. This was a reckoning, a collision between promises made on paper and truths carved into the land. They told us the Great Plains had been secured by the Treaty of Fort Laramie in 1868. I read about it in camp. The United States promised the Sioux Nation the sacred Black Hills would remain theirs forever. But forever ended the moment gold was discovered. Not even Custer himself could resist the gleam of it. In 1874, under government orders, he led an expedition into Sioux territory, and when they found gold, everything changed. The Black Hills were sacred. The Lakota believed the spirits of their ancestors lived in those mountains. But the government, under pressure from hungry miners and railroad men, saw only profit. When Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse refused to sell, they were labeled hostiles. Just like that, men defending their land became enemies of the state. And we were told we'd be the ones to bring them to heel. What they didn't tell us was that the so-called hostile camp wasn't just a band of rebels. It was the largest gathering of Sioux, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors in living memory, men who had fled reservation life and refused to give up their freedom. They weren't hiding. They were waiting. By the spring of 1876, Washington was desperate to crush resistance. They issued an ultimatum: all hostiles must report to agencies by January 31st or face military action. But the snows were deep, and the order was impossible. It was never about peace. It was a trap. That's when we were called. The 7th Cavalry, under Custer, was one of 3 converging columns. The plan was simple: trap the native warriors between our forces and deliver a swift blow. But there was a catch: we had no real idea where they were. Our scouts were nervous. Reports were vague. Even Custer's trusted Crow and Arikara scouts warned him the village ahead was the biggest we've ever seen. He didn't listen. June 25, 1876. We rode toward the Little Bighorn River under a sun that burned the earth dry. There were no bugles blaring, no flags waving, just dust, sweat, and tension. We thought we were hunting a small band of hostiles. In truth, we were riding straight into a hornet's nest. The village stretched for over 3 miles along the river. Hundreds of lodges, thousands of warriors. Custer divided the regiment, sending Reno into the valley and Benteen to scout the left flank. The rest of us pressed forward. I remember looking out over the bluffs and thinking, something's not right. We had expected fear, disarray. What we found was a people ready angry, united, and defending every inch of earth with the fury of those who had nothing left to lose. And still, no one called it off. There was no turning back. I heard a fellow soldier mutter, "We're walking into a trap." He wasn't wrong. The Sioux and Cheyenne weren't retreating, they were surrounding. People back east would later call it a massacre. But what I saw was something far more complicated. The government had lit this fire with every treaty it broke, every promise it twisted. By the time we rode into that valley, there was no negotiation left. I didn't know any of that when I first enlisted. I thought I was fighting to build a future. But the closer we came to Little Bighorn, the more I realized this wasn't our land. This wasn't our fight. And yet it would become the battle that defined our names forever. The truth is, the cavalry didn't march into glory that day. We marched into a storm no one was prepared for, led by ambition, blinded by underestimation, and buried by the weight of history crashing down all at once. My name is Charles Windolph, and if you think war is all about flags and music, you've been reading the wrong kind of stories. For me, it was dirt in my mouth, blood on my sleeve, and the gnawing fear that every day might be my last. I was born in Germany in 1851, one of thousands who left Europe chasing promises of freedom and opportunity. America seemed like the place to start over, but work was scarce, and the army offered steady pay and a bed, two things I couldn't easily find anywhere else. I didn't join for glory. I joined to survive. Yet there I was, 5 years later, riding under George Armstrong Custer, a man whose name echoed across campfires like both a blessing and a curse. He was bold, sometimes reckless, and there were nights we wondered if he truly saw the difference between courage and gambling with lives. But whatever doubts we whispered, one thing was certain when Custer looked at you and said, "Hold your ground." You believed you could. That belief kept men like me moving forward when everything inside screamed to stop. I wasn't a hero, and I knew it. My hands weren't made for killing. They were made for workloading, repairing, keeping things steady when chaos came. But in war, nobody asks what you were built for. You fight or you fall. On the morning of June 25th, I remember touching the butt of my carbine, feeling the slickness of sweat even before the sun was high. My horse trembled under me, and I wondered if it could sense what was coming. Part of me hoped the scouts were wrong, that the village ahead was small, that this would be just another fast raid, back to camp before nightfall. But deep down, I knew better. The closer we rode, the heavier the silence grew. I thought about home, about my mother back in Germany, who never wanted me to leave. I thought about how I had promised her I'd find a better life, not a grave on some foreign plain. I thought about the faces of men riding beside me, how most were immigrants like me, each carrying their own quiet story, none of us expecting to be immortalized in a headline we didn't write. And then, like a spark in dry grass, everything changed. We saw the village stretched along the Little Bighorn River, bigger than any of us imagined. Fear hit me first like cold water down my spine, then turned into something else, anger, not at the Sioux or Cheyenne, who were defending their home, but at the thought of how little we knew, how unprepared we were, and how none of this seemed to be about us, the men in the saddle. When the shooting started, instinct took over. I was no longer a farmhand turned soldier. I was just a man trying not to die. I remember shouting, handing ammunition, watching men I had known for years fall like wheat. Somewhere in that chaos, something inside me hardened. There was no time to mourn, no time to think, just act. People later asked me if I was brave that day. I tell them no, I was terrified. But courage isn't about being unafraid. It's about moving through fear anyway. And so I crawled when I had to, stood when I must, and kept going because someone had to. That someone happened to be me. I've carried that day with me ever since. Not just the sounds and sights, but the feeling that everything you are can be stripped away in an instant. War doesn't just change landscapes, it changes men. I went into Little Bighorn as a soldier hoping for routine victory, and came out as a survivor who would never see the world the same way again. I didn't choose to be a character in history. I was just a man who happened to live when history turned ugly and loud. And if you think that leaves you with a sense of pride, you'd be wrong. It leaves you with questions, ones you can't answer, ones you wake up with years later when the nights are too quiet, and you still hear the echoes of gunfire. The morning of June 25th, 1876 didn't feel like the start of history. It felt like any other campaign day, dust in our mouths, sweat trickling under the collar, the soft creak of saddle leather. Yet, even then, something felt wrong. My horse twitched under me, and the scouts Crow and Arikara men spoke in hurried tones I couldn't understand, but didn't need to. Their eyes told me everything. This wasn't going to be a small fight. We rode over a ridge and saw at the village. It wasn't just big. It was alive in a way that made the hair on my arms rise. Lodges stretched for miles, smoke curling skyward. Children scattered. Women hurried their families to safety. And warriors, so many warriors mounted up in a tide of movement I'd never seen before. My throat went dry. I thought of home, of my mother's kitchen in Germany, of promises I'd made to her, and for a moment, I wanted nothing more than to turn the horse around and ride until I couldn't breathe. But Custer gave no pause. He rode up and down the line, eyes bright, jaw set. "We hold them here," he said. Something in me wanted to believe him. After all, he'd never led us into disaster before, or maybe I just hadn't lived long enough to see one. The order to dismount came quick. We formed a skirmish line, rifles snapping into place. For a breath, there was silence, like the world was holding itself still. Then it broke, gunfire cracked, arrows hissed, and the earth came alive under pounding hooves. The Sioux and Cheyenne didn't come at us like panicked villagers. They came like men who'd been waiting for this moment all their lives. They hit us from the front, then the flank, and before long, from behind. I dropped to one knee, fired, reloaded, fired again, every shot blending into the next. The smell of powder burned my lungs. A bullet tore into my arm, hot, sharp, like someone had shoved a branding iron through me, but I couldn't stop. There was no time to bleed. I crawled to a wounded comrade, pushed cartridges into his trembling hands, shouted at him to keep shooting. The chaos was beyond anything I had ever imagined. Horses screamed and collapsed. Soldiers stumbled back into shallow depressions. Custer's voice still carried above it all, urging men to stand firm. But I could see it in his face when he realized we were surrounded. This wasn't a skirmish. This was annihilation waiting to happen. Pockets of men clung to cover, firing as fast as their shaking hands allowed. I flattened myself behind a dead horse, breathing in the stench of blood and dust, loading and firing with mechanical rhythm, because thinking too much meant freezing. Around me, friends I had eaten with the night before were suddenly silent, their eyes staring at the sky as if searching for answers I didn't have. There came a moment when the air shifted, when I knew the fight wasn't about winning anymore. It was about how long we could hold. Warriors on fast ponies circled tighter, bullets and arrows raining down, their voices fierce, echoing across the hills like thunder. I caught glimpses of painted faces, eyes burning with a fury I could almost understand. They weren't fighting for conquest. They were fighting because this was their home, their families just behind them. I felt a strange calm then, even as fear gnawed at my gut. I kept moving, passing ammunition, yelling for others to stay low, but inside, a voice kept saying, "This is it. This is how it ends." When Custer's position finally went quiet, I couldn't see him anymore. Smoke and dust cloaked everything. Men near me stopped firing, their ammunition gone. Some prayed, some cursed, some just stared blankly ahead. I pressed myself lower behind the horse, heart pounding so hard it hurt, waiting for the final rush that would end us. But somehow, I lived. Hours later, when the gunfire thinned and the warriors pulled back to their village, I was still breathing. Barely. My arm throbbed, my ears rang, and my body felt carved out of stone. I had survived a fight no one thought possible to walk away from. But in that moment, survival didn't feel like victory. It felt like being left with ghosts I would carry for the rest of my life. When the gunfire finally faded, it didn't feel like victory or even relief. It felt like falling into an abyss. The battlefield was silent except for the wind and the faint groans of the wounded. I sat there in the dirt, staring at a landscape that only hours earlier had been alive with shouts, gunfire, and pounding hooves. Now, it was still. Bodies lay everywhere. Men I had eaten breakfast with that morning now stared blankly at the sky, their hands still clutching rifles. The smell hit me hardest: gunpowder, blood, and something else I'd never forget. Something that told me no matter how far I ran, Little Bighorn would follow me. We were few, scattered, and dazed. Those who could still move crawled toward higher ground, clutching wounds and weapons. For 2 nights, we held on, waiting, wondering if we'd meet the same fate as Custer and his men. When reinforcements finally arrived and we descended to where Custer had made his last stand, the sight stopped even seasoned soldiers cold. I had seen death before, but not like this. It was chaos frozen in time: Custer and more than 200 men. There was no retreat, no mercy, just the raw, brutal truth of war. The Sioux and Cheyenne had won. But even in their victory, there was no gloating. I saw some of them at a distance, tending to their own dead. They hadn't fought for conquest. They fought because the ground we stood on was their home, and they weren't about to give it up. That realization hit me harder than any bullet. We weren't fighting monsters, we were fighting men who believed as fiercely in their cause. The news back east called it a massacre, painting Custer as a fallen hero and the tribes as savages. But those headlines didn't capture the complexity of what I'd seen. It wasn't just a military defeat, it was the collision of 2 worlds. In time, I was awarded the Medal of Honor for staying under fire to bring ammunition to the line. People shook my hand, called me brave, but bravery wasn't what I felt. What I felt was survival. That medal is heavy in ways no one understands. It doesn't just honor the moment I lived, it reminds me of all the men who didn't. The long-term consequences came quick and brutal. The government doubled its campaign, forcing tribes onto reservations with even harsher measures. Within a year, Crazy Horse was dead. Sitting Bull would eventually surrender, and the Sioux and Cheyenne, though victorious on that day, lost nearly everything they had fought to protect. For me, the battle never ended. It followed me into every quiet moment, every sleepless night. Sometimes I wake and hear the echo of gunfire or see the face of a comrade as he fell. People ask me what it was like, expecting a clean story of heroism or tragedy neatly wrapped up. I tell them the truth: it was chaos, it was fear, and it was a lesson that pride and misunderstanding can destroy whole worlds. Custer's last stand became history, but for me, it became memory, one that still grips me after all these years. I walked away alive, but a part of me is still there, kneeling behind a dead horse, hoping against hope to see another sunrise. You've walked with me through the smoke and fear of Little Bighorn. You've seen what I saw: the chaos, the courage, and the cost of a single afternoon. People often ask me if it was worth it, if history has judged it fairly. I don't have easy answers. I only know what it felt like to kneel behind that horse, to hear men call for help I couldn't give, and to live long enough to tell the story. So I'll ask you this: if you had stood where I stood, would you have fought, fled, or simply closed your eyes and prayed it would all pass? Do we remember battles like this because of the heroics, or because they remind us how fragile we really are? Share what you think in the comments. Your voice adds to the history we carry forward. And if these stories move you, if they make you think about the people behind the names, not just the dates, then stay with us. Subscribe, hit the bell icon, and explore more untold accounts of America's hidden conflicts. Every view, every comment, every share keeps these voices alive, so no one forgets the real people behind the legends.